full of clients with all of their needs as far as implementation and then making enhancements and anything they need. I'm sort of their go-to fractional architect. So I've come across lots of use cases, and I'm always trying to find ways to craftfully deliver those solutions on a budget and make sure we can have the most flexibility for customizing that solution. So this session was really born out of some discussions that have been occurring around different form tools that people are typically using in order to collect information from people on a public website. A lot of these use cases are like signing up for an email newsletter or registering for an event, or really any situation where you're trying to collect some information from somebody without having them need to log in. In the nonprofit world, this can be donations, this can be becoming a member. In the for-profit world, it's a lot of email signups, event registration, you name it. So what I wanted to do today was sort of walk through the basic setup for one of these situations from the very beginning. So I started a brand new developer edition org just 20 minutes ago, and I'm going to go through all the steps in order to get one of these form solutions set up so that you can start collecting information on a public website and put that information into your Salesforce org without having to use a third-party form tool. So I hope that makes sense. So here's our quick agenda for today. There's two main pieces to utilizing one of these solutions. The first one is to create a digital experience site. That used to be called Communities up until a few years ago when Salesforce rebranded it to Experiences. So those digital experience sites, it's essentially Salesforce's version of hosting a website. And there's a ton of functionality we can get into with digital experiences. We're only going to cover a little bit in order to get one of these form solutions set up. Now for the actual form side of things, we're going to be using a screen flow. So if you're familiar with flows, a lot of the reason I wanted to showcase these solutions is because Salesforce professionals are expected to know how to use flows in order to do all of their automation in Salesforce. So you can transfer those skills that you already have working with screen flows in order to build one of these form solutions. The third step is to take that screen flow and add it to our experience site. So I'll walk through those steps, and then I'll do some quick demos at the end, and if we have time, we can get into some advanced topics. So first step is to create our digital experience site. This is something that you only need to do one time for your organization. Every tier of Salesforce org allows you to create a digital experience site. You don't need any additional licensing to do this. So if you have access to like an enterprise org, which many of you probably have, you should be able to create, or you will be able to create one of these digital experience sites. And again, you only need to do this one time. If you have multiple forms, you can set up multiple forms on a single digital experience. So this is pretty easy. There's a couple steps here. We're going to go into setup and enable digital experiences. So I'll kind of flip back and forth and we'll do this one at a time. Here's my brand new developer edition org I just set up a few minutes ago. Let's go to experiences. And before you enable it, the only option you have is to go into the settings here. So all we have to do is check off enable. This just tells us it's going to use my domain name, whatever you've set up for your site. So typically this is the name of your company. All I'm going to do here is just enable that and then agree that this is going to create some additional roles in the role hierarchy to support licensing for external users. But that's something you can get into if you need to go down that path, but we'll just click OK for now. Because it's using a my domain name, it's going to tell you it needs to reload this tab essentially. So you can go ahead and click OK for that. This is all expected, so nothing to worry about here. Perfect. So that's step one, is just enabling digital experiences. We've already accepted the warnings. So the next thing we're going to do is create a brand new site. And what I recommend for this, in order to have the most flexibility for branding and not sort of try to figure out all the other things that you might want to take away, I like to start from scratch with a very plain vanilla empty site experience is what they call it. So I use the build your own template, the Aura version. Now there is a newer version for Lightning Web Runtime. At this point, it doesn't support embedding a flow, so I don't recommend setting that up quite yet. In the future, I hope they bring flows to the Lightning Web Runtime, and then we could use the newer one. So I'm going to create a new digital experience here. And they call this choosing a template. It's really just setting the foundation for which features you're going to have available when you use this Experience Cloud site. So if you scroll down, you'll find this Build Your Own Aura by Salesforce. It's very plain vanilla, so if you wanted to add your own custom stylings, you're adding on instead of having to go find and strip away and replace with a bunch of other styles. So I'm going to get started with this one. For the name, this name shows up in multiple places. So when you enter the name here, it's used for the internal name, so you'll find that in setup. It's used for the site title, so that's what shows up to people in the browser when they navigate to this site. And it also becomes the name of the profile that's set up for the guest user. So every time you enable one of these digital experiences, you get a free guest user profile. Essentially, it allows people to access your site without having to log in at all. We can further customize the name, that value in those three places, but just know that when you're first setting it up, that's where that name is coming from, is when you name your site initially. I'm going to call this site name for now. We have an optional subdirectory we can specify here. If you're setting up multiple experience sites, you will need to specify a subdirectory for the second and any subsequent ones. For our first one, we don't need to do a subdirectory, so I'll leave that blank. Then we click create, and this is going to spend a few minutes setting up that brand new digital experience site. While that's loading, there's a couple other steps we need to do to make this Experience Cloud site accessible to the public. So we're going to go into the builder, and in the settings area, we have this checkbox for public access, which allows guest users to interact with the site. So let's go ahead and do that as soon as it is ready. Here's our site. We have a bunch of different areas. The two workspaces you're going to use most often are the builder, which is actually where you drag and drop components onto a site page. And then you might need to look through the administration area for any overall settings. So be aware of those two. Those are the two main focuses for simple Experience Cloud site implementations. Our first step here is to go into the builder. This is our brand new site. This is the home page. But down here on the left, we have settings, which apply to the overall site. And for public access, all we need to do here is check off this box in order to allow guest users to see and interact with the site without logging in. Here's our site title. So if we needed to change what appears in the browser tab bar up here, you can change that title. This one only appears briefly while your page is loading. Each page you set up on your digital experience has its own title, so you can further customize that once the page finishes loading and call it whatever you want to call it. But just be aware of these two settings here in the settings area. So once that is set, that's all we really need to do for our one-time operation for setting up a digital experience site. Our next phase here is to build a screen flow. So I'll go through those steps. And what I wanted to emphasize here was some people might not be as familiar with building screen flows, but if you're already using some other third-party form tool, a lot of those concepts and that functionality also exists with ScreenFlow. It's just called by a different name. So if you're used to Form Assembly or Form Stack or Form Titan and their form solutions where you're setting up a new form, adding pages to it or a page break, and then you add content, objects, or elements to the pages, you're doing the same thing in a ScreenFlow. So we're going to set up a ScreenFlow. We're going to add a screen to it, which is equivalent to one of these pages. And then we're going to put components on that screen, which is the same thing as putting content or objects or elements from some of these other tools. So this is nothing to be afraid of. I really want to emphasize that you're already doing these things using other solutions, and Salesforce offers the same when you're working with these screen flows. So let's set up a very simple screen flow. I'll do some of the basics and then we'll configure this screen here. So I'm going to switch back over to Salesforce setup. If you ever need to get back to that, in this workspaces tab, you can click on that and get back to Salesforce setup that way. We're going to search for flows here. And it's under process automation. And we're going to go ahead and create a brand new flow in the top right corner. Now this is going to be a screen flow. There's lots of different types of flows. Some do record triggered automation, platform events, but for this use case, we need a screen in order for people to interact and input data into that screen. And then we can process that data and send it in to a Salesforce record. So I'll use a screen flow and click create. Now this is the part where, like in some of these other form tools, you're creating a new form and you're going to add a page or a page break or an area to start organizing what you want your actual form to look like. So our first element here that we need to add is a screen. Now on the screen, we're going to do a couple things. We want to configure the footer. This allows you to customize the buttons. So instead of calling it next or finish, we can change that to a custom label and call it submit. So down here is configure footer. And for the navigation, this next or finish button, I can use a custom label. And I'll call this submit. That shows up here. I typically don't want people to navigate to a previous page, so you can typically hide this. You might use a custom label and allow it for some use cases, but just be aware you can hide that button completely, as well as the pause button. So I pretty much never want to use the pause button. I've yet to find a use case for that. So just know you can come in here and hide it so people aren't clicking things you're not expecting them to. Okay. So we hide both of those, and then we're going to add some components to our screen. So let's do that. Over here in the components area, the one I like to use a lot is just input text. It gives you the most granularity for controlling the validation and making sure you're accepting valid input before moving on. Some of the other pre-built components like name and email, it seems like they should get you to that end goal of validating all of the input data, but there's always some little gap or something missing from that built-in functionality, and there's no way to further tailor it. So starting with a text element gives you full control over each of those validations. And this is something I like to really emphasize when you're working with these form tool solutions. You're probably used to this from other third-party tools. You really need to lock down and validate all of the input so that you don't accidentally create an error or allow bad data into your Salesforce org or have it fail. So taking the extra steps here to validate input really goes a long way to making sure these form tools work reliably, robustly, and consistently. So the first field I'm going to add is first name. We'll talk about default values in a bit and component visibility. So there are some fancy features we can get into there. First name fields on like a contact record accept up to 40 characters. So we're going to validate our input and make sure that the length of that first name field is up to 40 characters. So the way we do that is, and I'll zoom in so you can see, we can check the length of that input. So I'm going to wrap my first name field in a length function and make sure that it's less than or equal to 40. So this is how you can validate to make sure your length is of a certain limit. So this actually needs to go down here in the formula area. Sorry about that. And then for the error message, we can say, please enter up to 40 characters. So that'd be the error message if somebody tries to enter more than 40 characters there. You also have the option down here to provide help. So if you need any other explanation, you can add that and it'll put this little help bubble text next to the field. So lots of user interface options that you have here. But again, most importantly, I would highly recommend always validate the data to make sure it's going to be successful when you try to create this record later on. I'll add another text field for last name. Very similar. I can require it. I'm going to validate this input and say, please enter up to 80 characters. That's the length of a last name field on a contact record. The formula for this is very similar. All we're going to do is check the length of the last name field. So I'll copy this, go down here to validate input, and I'll just swap out which field we are referencing. So this will be the last name field. So if the length of the last name field is less than or equal to 80, this is valid. Now you might realize that these validation formulas are sort of the reverse if you were creating a formula in Salesforce. The reason for that is because Flow was purchased by Salesforce and it already had some of these functionalities, and I think it was too complicated for them to try to reverse the logic for these validation inputs, so they sort of left it as is, and it's been one of those crazy quirks ever since that what you want to specify here is the valid condition, like when is it okay for this data to be submitted. That's why we're checking the length and making sure it's less than or equal to 80 when we're working in flows. Okay, the last thing we'll do is an email field. So we want first name, last name, and email in order for somebody to sign up for a newsletter, for example. So again, I'm going to use a text field. I'm going to call this email. I can make it required and say, please enter a valid email address up to 80 characters. Now for emails, it gets a little more complicated to make sure that you're accepting a valid email and there are no commas involved. So there's a couple extra pieces to this formula that I recommend implementing. So first thing we'll do, like with the others, is check the length to make sure it is less than or equal to 80. So in here, I would just check the length of that email field. And we can add subsequent criteria. So the next thing we want to check is to make sure there are no commas in that email field. So it does not contain comma. Can do it like that. And the last thing we'll do is a regular expression, which will actually check for the formatting of an email address value. This makes sure that we have a handle, an @ sign, a domain, and then like the .com piece. So I have worked with a regular expression, looks a lot like this. In order to do this check, So we take the email address, we set it all to lowercase, we make sure it starts with some characters. Here's all the valid characters. We make sure there's an @ sign, and then we make sure there's some characters following that, and then we make sure there's a period, and we make sure there's some characters happening, at least 2 characters after that period. Now you're welcome to use this. I can put this in the chat if you're curious, or reach out and we can work with that. Now, one of the things that's been stumping me for a long time is, why do I need to do both? Like, why do I have to check it for the comma and then do a regular expression? I cannot for the life of me figure out why this regular expression does not uh, flag the comma that shows up. So I will happily pay somebody who can figure that out a $100 gift card if you can get this regular expression to catch commas, so I wouldn't have to do this step. So if you're in for that challenge, I'll post this in the chat. Let me know if you can optimize that, and I'll get you a $100 gift card. Okay. We have our 3 fields set up on our screen. I'll click done here, because I have 2 errors. What is it upset about? Oh, I need to label my screen, sorry. Okay. So that's our screen component. It handles all the input and the visual interaction people are going to have with that, validation rules, all of that wonderful stuff. Again, my pro tip: validate every input. The next thing we're going to do is we need to connect that data input to our Salesforce records. So again, these other third-party form tools use things that are called connectors or integrations. They have one of many integrations, where Salesforce is just one of them. And then they allow you to actually do an action, like create a record, update a record, look up a record, find a record, delete a record, all that wonderful stuff. The Salesforce elements, the equivalent for this is named very much the same thing: create records, update, get. Instead of doing a field mapping, which is a lot of what these other tools call it, a field mapping, we're simply setting field values for the records we want to interact with. So again, this is concepts you're probably already used to from these other tools, and I'm just showing you what Flow calls that inside of Salesforce. It's not a separate connector or an integration, it's just the data elements that you can add to your Flow canvas. What I like about this is it gives you a ton of flexibility to do some data things before a screen loads and do some data things after a screen loads. And you can even get more complex with that and have a um, whole sandwich of operations happening, where you get some records, you show a screen, and then you do something with that data, and then you show another screen, and you can rinse and repeat and really get as complex as you need to. So the way we add one of those other elements, we just click the plus sign, and down here in the data section, these are all of our elements that will allow us to interact with Salesforce data using the input from our screen previously. So we're adding this data element right after the screen, and we're going to use the create records in order to create a contact record here. So we'll call this create contact. For this simple example, we'll just create one. There are use cases where you can gather up a whole collection of records and process them in bulk, where you would use the multiple and separate resources. So we can get into some advanced topics if you need to. For now, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to create one record using separate resources, and we're going to create that record in the contact object. So we'll select that here. This will say first name. So the first name field on the contact is going to get its value from the first name text input on our screen component. So that's how the mapping works here. And you can do multiple. So we can add another field mapping. We'll say last name on the contact record gets its value from the last name screen component. We'll do a third one for the email address field, gets its value from the email screen component that we set up. Perfect. So that's all we need to do for that piece. We have all of our field mappings here. The last thing we'll do is we'll put a success message at the end of this form so that people know it went through successfully, and it sort of gives us some options for what do you want to do next. A lot of these other form tools I actually think they have terrible names for this. They call it either notifications or emails and actions or on submit behavior, which I guess is the best one. In Salesforce Flow, all we're doing is we're just going to add another screen to the end of our canvas here, and we'll just use some display text to show a success message. So that's pretty simple. We'll add another screen like we did before, and we'll just customize the options there. So far our canvas, it starts, we load that screen, we collect some data, and then we create a contact record. Once that's done, we'll add our final screen for our success message. Now what I like to do here is for the simple use case, we simply show the success page and we don't allow any further navigation. So I'm just going to uncheck the show footer option, and that gets rid of all buttons on the page. The only other thing we need is our actual success message. You can use a display text element to do that. So we'll drag that onto our screen here. This is our success message. Say, congratulations. Your information has been submitted. Now you can put merge fields in here. Like I could put the person's first name just by pulling in that first name screen component from the resources here. So you have a lot of flexibility to make this dynamic, style it. We can format certain things. I can make the first name bold. So if I highlight that, I have the rich text editor down here to format that text. So even in a very simple use case here, you have a ton of flexibility to put hyperlinks, lists, you can reference the data they submitted, all kinds of things. That's it for our success screen. Format as desired. Oh, the last thing I'll do is I'll make the whole thing centered. That tends to look a little better. And we can make this a little bit bigger. Instead of 12, let's do 18. Perfect. I'll hit done. Here's our entire screen flow. We have the screen where we're collecting information. We are creating the contact record in Salesforce with that, and then we show a success screen at the end. So now we're just going to save and activate this, and then we're going to grant access. So there's one final step here in order to make sure public users can access this flow. So let's go ahead and save. We'll call this the email newsletter sign up. You can put a description, create a contact record with information from the submitter. We have advanced options down here. So we want to run this flow in system context without sharing. This is one of the steps in order to make it so guest users can use this flow and then won't run into any access issues. They're only able to sort of run those actions in the context of this flow without you having to grant them that permission on their profile. So this is what Salesforce recommends as the most secure way to set up one of these solutions and not grant too much access to public users. So the way we do that, down here where it says how to run the flow, we're going to change this to system context without sharing, access all data. That'll let them run those elements that are in part of our flow and do nothing else at any point using the API. Okay, so we'll save that. This little warning just says our success screen doesn't have navigation, so we're aware of that. We want that on purpose so that there's nowhere else to go once you get to the end of this. The last thing we'll do is back in the setup menu for that new flow we just created, our email newsletter sign up, you have this option here to edit access. This is new. I think the last release, Salesforce started enforcing this. If you want to grant access to a flow for a public guest user, you have to specifically enable it for a profile. So we do need to come in here to this flow, override the default behavior, and restrict access to certain enabled profiles. Now, what's annoying is our guest user profile does not show up in this list. We have to get to that a different way, which I'll show you in the next step, but this is the way to get to this checkbox in order to allow for this configuration. So I'm going to check that and hit save. Everything I'm covering today is in the slide deck, which I can put the link at the end and you can have access to this if you want to review it. So our last step here is to add our flow to the experience site. So this is bringing together the two steps that we've done so far and putting the final touches on our solution. From the other form tools, this is typically called publishing a form or making it available, or it sort of generates the URL. So we're going to go through that piece and how you do that in Salesforce using a digital experience site. This all happens in the builder. I like to create a new page for each form that I'm publishing. That allows you to use the same site for multiple forms if you want to do that. And it's pretty simple. We're just going to drag and drop a flow component, edit some of those properties, and then I'll show you how to piece together the public URL. The first thing we'll do is create a new page on our digital experience site. We can call it whatever we want. We get to choose what the URL is going to be. I think this is one of the nicer parts about setting up these flow form screen solutions is you get total control over the URL. Some of the other form tools generate a random ID, a bunch of numbers. You can customize that probably if you go through those steps, but it's very simple to do that in Salesforce here. Let's create a new page. Back in our experience site, I'm in the builder section. So in the builder part. Right now we're looking at the home page. From the pages menu at the top here, we can go ahead and create a new page. I like to use a standard page for all my new pages. And instead of using one of these existing sort of templates, you can go ahead and create a new blank page. And it gives you the option to do the flexible layout, which is super flexible. So let's go ahead and select that. For the name of the page, we're going to call it our email newsletter sign up. It will auto-generate a URL subdirectory. You can customize that if you want to. And I'll go ahead and create this. So here's our new page, and then we will add our flow component to that page. So this is a lot of text, but it actually is very simple. Another thing I should do before we do that is make sure I activate my flow so it shows up as available. Flow is activated. So back here on our Experience Builder page, in the component menu, you can search for flow and just drag that component onto our page. It asks you to choose which flow do you want to run. Down here we have our email newsletter sign up as an option. That's pretty much it. So we can do other things on this page. The flexible layout lets you style that section. So if you wanted to make this narrower, there's just a drag bar here. You can make your flow a little bit narrow. So I'm going to put it at about 60% and leave it like that for our simple setup. So that just gives us some nice margins. Okay. Last thing we'll do here is we're going to publish this page. So every time we're working in our experience builder, it's sort of constantly saving what you're doing as you're making changes. So you won't find a save button anywhere. But when you want to see the effects of your changes live on a site, if you're like accessing it as a guest user, somebody not logged in, you want to click this publish button at the top right corner. So this tells you here's where you're going to access your site. It'll send you an email confirmation. It's usually pretty instant. Within a few seconds, you'll get that confirmation. So let's go ahead and publish that. The last thing we have to do is the piece where we make this flow available to our guest user profile. It's something that's easiest to get to from the settings page here in the builder. So we're going to go to settings, click on our guest user profile, edit the flow access, and enable that email sign up flow. So from here, I go to settings. At the bottom of the general area, you'll see the guest user profile. It, by default uses that name we named our Experience Cloud site. We click on that, it opens a new tab in Salesforce Setup and takes you to that profile. There's no other easy way to get to this. They sort of hide it in a lot of the UI, but you can get to it from that settings page. We want to adjust the enabled flow access. So from that related list, we will click on Edit. And because this is the only flow where we overrode the permissions in order to grant access to specific profiles, it's the only one that shows up here. We just want to move that over to the enabled flows section. Perfect. So that's everything about adding our flow to a site page, publishing that page, making sure we're granting the required access. Now we can test it. So this is probably the most confusing piece. I wish this was easier, but we can piece together the URL in order to access our new form from a public site without being logged in. So all we have to do is take the base URL for our digital experience site and add on the page URL that we set up and customized. So I'll show you where we can get both of those pieces of information. The base URL for your digital experience site can be seen here in the settings in the general tab. We have this URL. I'm going to copy that address. Let me show what I'm doing here. And what I like to do is set this up in a incognito window. The reason for that is so that you're not accessing this page as a logged in Salesforce user. Because I'm an administrator right now, so of course I have access to everything. But if we want to see what this looks like for a public user, I want to do it in an incognito window, so it's a different session altogether. You can use a separate browser if you want to do it that way, but make sure you're testing it as the appropriate user. We have our base URL, and then we just need the page URL for this page that we set up. So if we click on the gear icon to get to the page properties for this page, it shows you that URL. So if we copy that piece, our email newsletter sign up subdirectory, we tack that on to the end of our base URL, we will be able to load up this page on our digital experience site. I'm not logged into Salesforce in this incognito window, but I can go ahead and enter my information here. I'll click submit. Here's my success page. It says, congrats, Evan, pulled in my first name. It's bolded, centered this text. My information's been submitted. And if I flip back into my Salesforce org and go look at contact records, go look at all contacts. Oh, here's Evan Ponter, that new record that just got created. Pretty cool. So a very simple use case here, but just wanted to show the basic mechanics of setting up one of these digital experience sites and connecting it to your Salesforce org so you can start creating data. You can do a lot more with updating data and searching for different records. There's a ton of functionality here. If you all want to test this yourself, here I'll put this URL in the chat. You can load up that form, and you're definitely not logged in, so you'll be able to submit your information that way, and we can take a look at the results that come in. So usually I get to this point in the presentation and people have a ton of questions and they want to do more. There's a bunch of advanced topics we can get into. If you have any questions right off the bat, you can come off mute and ask away, and hopefully we can get some of these answered.
Hi, Ponder. Can I have a question? I'm from Bay Area, from Manakwi. Salesforce certified newly. So, and this very nice tutorial. I just like curious that what's the difference between lightning experience and the digital experience? Because
Good
it's
question.
yes. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the Lightning experience is what Salesforce set up for like the internal user interactions. So like here, when I'm looking at Salesforce records, this is Lightning experience. The functionality that they have built in order to publish public sites. So everything we're looking at here, it's called a digital experience. It's really just the new name for communities. If you're new to Salesforce, you might have never heard of communities, but essentially this is just allowing us to host a site that is supported by Salesforce technology and allows us to do things like set up one of these pages and allow people who have no access to our Salesforce org to have certain functionalities which we can customize to, like we're doing here, create a record in a Salesforce organization. So the best way to sort of boil that down is Lightning Experience is what your logged in authenticated users will interact with internally inside of Salesforce. A digital experience is what non-authenticated users outside of Salesforce could use to have limited functionality to your Salesforce data.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the another question that earlier that you have mentioned that we do not need or require a license or the really we don't need the license for creating this one, like the one that you created newsletter. So
Yeah.
can we create our own?
Yeah, absolutely. So every Salesforce organization comes with the ability to create these digital experience sites. You already have a license, and you can create 100 of these. It's part of the licensing you already pay for. So creating that digital experience is totally free. And because each one comes with a guest user license, you can make them available for public guest users and then set up a solution like this, all totally included with the licensing cost you're already paying for.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see if anybody else submitted their contact information. Might have some silly answers in here. New this week, probably everybody. I see a couple new names in here. Cool.
I you from our group. Mhm.
Okay, so what we could do is I have this in the chat. I have a quick little poll here. If you access that poll, there is an example I set up where you can vote for a couple advanced topics. So this shows off a few other things you could do with one of these ScreenFlow solutions, is do a poll. So I have a data table. I'm sourcing some records and pulling in their description, but you can read through this. I have about 13 things here that people typically ask about when we're talking about this stuff. And we can look at those results and then dive into a few of those topics. Another question I get from people sometimes is, can I just see how you built this flow, right? So if that's of interest too, let me know. We could take a look at that if you want in our last 10 minutes here. Any other questions while you're filling out that poll?
Can everyone see the poll?
Yeah, so the people in the room,
I mean, I'm online. I'm here on the.
Could we pick
yeah.
Sorry.
Could we pick more than two?
Yeah, I limited it to 2 per person, but if you load the URL again, you can do 2 more if you want to have some lightning fast fingers there. The people in the room, I'll kind of go through these and
Yeah,
you can.
everybody can see, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Let's do this. I'll make it bigger. Conditional visibility. So if you want to do things like branching logic to display certain questions, that's one topic we could get into. The repeatable sections that comes up in some of these other tools. That's if you wanted to collect a set of answers multiple times. Default values. So this is pre-filling a form field. This is a good example, is like you want somebody to update their contact information. So you want to show them a first name, last name, email, and pre-fill those fields so they can just make adjustments. Dynamic choices. This is getting data from Salesforce to use as choices for a form question. A great example is what you're looking at here, is pulling in some choices dynamically. Email confirmation. So if you wanted to send an email to the submitter, we can set up one of those actions after the form gets to that success page. Error handling. So adding fault paths to our flow elements to define what happens when something goes wrong. We want to get a little bit more advanced, we can navigate to other URLs for the like success confirmation. That does require an Apex action to do that, but not too difficult to set up. Subflows. So sometimes people want to reuse logic by multiple forms. I have seen some good patterns for using subflows. Authenticated visitors. So some use cases require you want people to actually log in and see a lot of data and have access to more sensitive data. That does come with a licensing cost if you wanted to set that up, but I could talk through a little bit of what's required there. Branding. So a lot of times the question is, how do I make the page green or bold text, or I want to change the CSS for the headers. We can take a look at some of those options. Down here at the bottom is using a custom domain name. So if you wanted to, instead of having the my domain name that's internal, you could set up a totally custom one. That will just cost you the price of owning a domain. Embedding in a website. So what I've showed so far is you can generate a URL, and this is available to anybody. A lot of times the easiest way to make use of this is on whatever website you have, you just hyperlink to this URL. The same way you're sending people to that third-party form tool like FormStack or FormAssembly, you just paste in this link instead and it loads up this page. So you have that already, but some people actually want to embed a flow in their existing site for various reasons, so there's not that navigation step. That is a little bit more complicated. I have done it for a few clients, so I could talk about the steps required for that. It is a little more developer-y, so if you need that advanced functionality, we could take a look. And then pre-filling a form with URL parameters. That's something that these other tools do, and you can recreate that in a Salesforce flow. So I know some of the people online have access to that link. We can look at the results from what's been voted on so far. Sheba, if you want to sort of gather what is the most interesting topic from people in the room, and we can get their votes in as well. Looks
I
like
guess we need- Hey, Evan, I think so. We need you for second week one more time.
a second week. Okay.
Because like I guess all the stuff that you're talking about, all are interesting stuff. and
Yeah.
Kind of thing, because like it's the first is the basics, right? So basically, when
Right.
people understand how the basics work, that's great. And now instead of 3 fields, you can have 10 fields or whatever it is, right? And forms are everywhere, right? So maybe you're getting in competition with the form stack guys and other people. The couple of things which I come to mind is like, say we had a nonprofit kind of thing, and say authenticated users can only see some stuff kind of thing, and some pre-filling information
Mhm.
stuff from that perspective. That looks interesting for now, kind of thing
Yeah.
from my side. But what else? Anybody else has any?
I voted on this, or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Some people already voted out. We have some laptops here open.
Yeah. Okay.
The main consensus what I see in the room is everything. But-
Everything. Okay.
So that's why I said, okay, we go 2 rounds rather than everything, like we can't do everything covered
I
up.
think we need to vote if there's gonna be another week of this, so.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So the sharing settings, we have that guest users, so you can share with guest users certain records.
Certain records. Yes. Okay.
So like you have like either with criteria or ownership sharing, or third, they just took out, they just added that guest user. So how does that play a role into viewing certain records?
Yeah, it could. So the way I've sort of been able to avoid all of this, so I think what you're talking about is like if you were trying to share accounts and I add a new sharing rule, one of your options here is to grant access to guest users based on criteria, right? Yeah. So this works, but it's global. So people are going to have access to like any active account if they query it with the like API. So a safer way to do it is in your flow. I have this set up to run as system. So the only way people get access to data from like a get records in here is if they're running the flow. They don't have direct API access in order to query for those records. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it runs in the system mode irrespective of the sharing?
Correct. Yeah. So I didn't set up any sharing settings for this example. All I had to do was allow my flow to run in system mode without sharing in order to access all data. There are situations where you might need to grant access to certain records depending on what your code is doing, if you have triggers or something set up. So knowing about the sharing settings is useful. And I have had to do that for some clients that have installed packages and other things happening where that guest user does need a little bit of access to some of the records in order for some of these solutions to work.
Okay.
So just be aware though that when you set it up this way, it's granting API access to that guest user profile so they can use that API to access that data outside of the flow if they were clever enough to figure out how to do that.
Mhm.
So be very careful with your sharing settings. And when you do this, I would also take a look at the field level access you're granting. Really strip that down to its bare minimum and only grant read access to the fields where people need read access. And if you're doing edit access, the same applies. Only grant that edit access where you absolutely need it.
Mhm.
But great question.
Okay, that was just fabulous, and I think everybody took away quite a few pointers, both for experience side building as well as flow creation. And summer 23 came up with so many new features. So yeah, did you create? So the data table had some love this release too. You can share searchability and etc.
Yeah, there's some new features in the data table. So I just used the basic one in order to create this little poll. So I don't have any of those brand new advanced features, but yeah, you could totally add that search bar here and be able to sort through and search these different topics that I created. So I know we're at the hour mark. It sounds like we could just do a whole nother session and get into some of these advanced topics. I don't know if you wanted to pivot to that or
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's all a question of your availability.
okay.
It's all gather around to, hey.
Okay.
Like you give like a teaser, what I say that, and from the teaser, I guess it's also throws for people to start thinking more, what all you can do, right?
Yeah.
Because right now, you just showed a simple form, like, hey, just a first name, last name, email, right? But
Right.
forms are everywhere, right? So then you put logical jumps out there, then authenticated users, like you might just fill the first name.
Yeah.
So at a high level, how would you do the show the first name to the person because it's the guest user, right? Or do you need licenses for that?
You don't need licenses. So it yeah, it's going to really depend on what you want to do. So a lot of times that use case is like pre-fill a form with a URL parameter is sort of the safest way to do that. You could email somebody a link. You're going to expose basically the contact record ID is one way to do it. You
Right.
could just merge in, if you only have a few fields, you could just merge in their first name and last name into the URL. And then we would use URL parameters to
Got it.
pre-fill the form using default values.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So in case you want to validate the
I
email
have-
address, and I said hey, and your first name, last name, and email address is there.
Yeah.
Update that, right?
Totally possible.
Got it.
I have a question before you leave.
Sure.
Sheba and Ponder. Since I'm new here and you guys are such, coming from huge background in Salesforce, and I have done my certification, first certification, admin 201, in like 4 months. And really, it's very hard to get in the job market. It's very tough question. I don't know, this is not the platform, but since you guys here, so would you mind arrange when you have a chance or opportunity that arranging kind of this event that how like for the guidance or
Sorry, your question was to arrange a session for admin certification?
You lost her.
Oh, I lost you, Salma.
is this,
Mic is
yes.
muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes, my question was that can you arrange like event, this kind of event that for the newly certified Salesforce, how you get into the job, how we search the job market for the Salesforce, because it's been 4 months and really I'm struggling. Even I have a Trailblazer, and doing exercises there and, so your words.
Yeah, I mean, that this is a whole separate topic that we could talk for a long time. So basically, it's few pointers are networking and practicing a lot of interviewing. We had a mock interview sessions. So you practice with, you can hit me up, and if you want to practice with me, how to interview, I could give you pointers what's a strong point, where you could improve, stuff like that. Job market is a little bit fluctuating right now. So you'll need to create your own portfolio. There's developer org available where you can create a portfolio and you can showcase your learning, your skills in that. And Salesforce is also a lot of transferable skills count. So if you have designing background, if you have journalistic or a writing background, all kinds of backgrounds are valid, and they can find a spot in the ecosystem. So
yeah, and I can add one more thing over here for you is like right now, Evan pointed out 15 different use cases, right? So you can use a creativity, take a dev org, and you can put all the 15 use cases, show to people what you can do, and just publicize it too. So because it's like what Evan has done is like a different level. Like if you see a lot of people will go and buy a form stack or some other form that's easy to integrate, like an app. But this is like creating yourself, and it's just like what Evan just showed you, just 3 different fields, but you can add 5 fields, 4 fields, that's your creativity. So that's what you can show to a prospective employer, that what you can do, kind of thing.
And certifications count too. And if not certifications, if you can't gather too many certifications, super badges are available for free. They also are very close to the real life scenarios, and they can help to beef up your portfolio.
Okay.
So there are
Thank you.
several ways, yeah, but we can have a separate topic on this one whole session, and we can find experts
I guess
on
you have
this
the
topic
recordings
as
too,
well.
right, from the last week's information.
Yeah, in the YouTube channel, you can see the mock interviews session, and that had a lot of pointers on how to tell a story and how to, answer questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Nice to hear from you. You wanted to answer.
So I have a question for Evan. Okay. Oh, okay.
Sure,
I
go
have a
ahead.
question for Evan.
Yeah.
So you were using display text, right? For email as well.
No. We're
So
just curious to know why you
Yeah.
use the text field with validation for email, because email
There is
shows
also
the
an email
correct
option,
format,
right?
right? But why is the reason to use the text field with the validation rule?
for
Yeah.
email.
I found that email input field does not actually validate for a valid email. There. Oh, can you hear me out there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So that, yeah, you might want to mute your microphone in the room.
Yeah.
Okay, so the email input field doesn't cover all the validation required in order to get a valid email address. So I was using it with a few solutions, but found if people put a comma or they went over 80 characters, it was still allowing some of that to come through, which would just cause a fault in the flow. So by using a text input element and doing the validation yourself, you have full control over making sure you have all the validation required. And that's led to a lot less issues for these solutions as I've been implementing them. So I wanted to showcase, good examples of what I recommend using and not taking that shortcut of trying to use the email input just because it's sort of 90% there, but not all the way. Any other questions?
Okay. Yeah, it looks like few people had the same question in mind.
So
So do you suggest to use the text field all the time with validations rather than using the
email.
other standard fields available in this screen element?
Yeah. So I do recommend that text input field gives you the most flexibility because you can set the validation, you can set the help text, you can control the visibility. It just gives you all of the options where some of those other pre-built components don't have everything. So I tend to use a lot of just the vanilla inputs, either text or if you're collecting a number or a date, like you can use numbers and dates. But stick with the basic ones, not anything that tries to do too much, like that name component doesn't always work out the way you want it to. The email component doesn't always work out the way you want it to. You just have to be very stringent because these forms are going to be published on the internet. People are going to enter all kinds of things. So you have to be able to, the best use case is, or the best situation is you validate it on the screen before they submit and get them to correct that data. That's the best time to make sure you're getting clean data from people and not try to process it after the fact or run into errors or be making guesses about what they meant.
So what is your suggestion for phone fields?
Good question. So for phone fields, I have been, well, it depends what you want to do. So the Salesforce phone field doesn't have a ton of validation on it. I mean, it has like a length limit, so you definitely want to have a length there. You can use a text field, and if you are requiring a certain format for phone numbers, you could do that with the regular expression, kind of like what I showed for the email address. If you're a little bit more free form about it, you can just make sure the length is of a certain length and sort of allow any other input at that point. There's plenty of room there. If you are really strict about phone numbers, make sure you're getting, 10 digits for a US phone number. You can control if you want them to put the leading one or not. You can handle international phone numbers. There's also a consideration for extensions, so make sure people can say I'm at extension 216 at the end of their phone number. There's a lot of use cases there. It's all going to depend on what's important to your organization and what kind of data you want to allow as acceptable. But all that nuance you can control with the input validation on that screen, and you can give them help, with the help bubble to show them if you want a specific format. The other thing you can do is like require people to enter numbers, and then you can put in dashes or parentheses yourself if you want to do it that way. But there's a ton you can do with screen flows and submit logic there in order to format every piece of data the way exactly you want it to appear in the database.
Yeah, a quick question. So basically, like as a site can have multiple pages. So technically you can have multiple forms, right? So as unlimited number of forms if you want to, right?
Correct.
With one site, because site is 100 sites, but one site can have unlimited number of pages as such, right?
Yeah. So the only reason you would need multiple sites is if you wanted to like use multiple custom domain names for the base URL portion. But if you pick a very generic one for your one digital experience site, that's all you should really need, and you can host multiple forms. So it would be like name of your company.my.salesforcesites.com, whatever it is, / email sign up for like this example. You could do / preference center. If you wanted to set up a preference center form and have people update those options. But yeah, you could just set up a new page and it'll give you a new subdirectory URL for a subsequent form on that same site.
Right. So we've done the custom domain stuff. And if you were to embed it in like a WordPress site, so that's an iframe thing, or is it more complicated than that kind of thing? So maybe I know we have a separate session on that for sure.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff is there. So
yeah. So I haven't done an iframe. That's really not best practice. There's a lot of security concerns. So the way I've done the embedding, if you wanted to do that in your own third-party site, you actually use Lightning out in order to get all of the JavaScript needed in order to actually run a flow using native components that are inserted into that page.
right.
So that's where that topic does get a little advanced, but it is really cool once you get it working with the right core settings and you get that Lightning out script set up. You're basically putting a JavaScript onto your third-party site, and it will insert your flow as a component, which then loads your flow runtime on that third-party site.
Another advanced question, but we don't talk right now, but at a very high level. Can you also expose a small dashboard? Like, for example, we have a nonprofit, like a donors, you want to show them some kind of impact kind of thing, but on a restricted page, how will that work? A similar way?
So using a native Salesforce dashboard, you're gonna need, say it again?
I'm just thinking like, okay, I'm just looking at the native functionality right now. If not, then I know you have to get the licenses and log in and all this, because one option I'm looking at, you get a community side, you get the login licenses, but in case you have like you just want to show the impact, right? So basically like nonprofit doing an impact and the data is in Salesforce. You just want to expose one component, maybe nothing much, like one component or two component, whatever it is, right? 2 pages, no big deal. But same concept. So you have to make LWC component, or how will that work out?
Yeah, so if you want to use like reports or dashboards on an Experience Cloud site, you are going to need licensing in order to do that.
Okay.
The guest users cannot access those components.
I'm aware of that,
So what I've done for some other clients is you can embed a screen flow that's display only, and you can even use a rich text display element.
Yes.
And then you could format HTML.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And then you could reference any Salesforce data you want, pull that in and format it in your HTML and generate whatever that is. If we stop recording, I could show you a very quick example of that with one of my actual clients, but I don't want to get it on the recording.
Oh, 1 second, yes, yeah.
Yeah.